My dad is innocent. I can prove it." And when a 6-year-old held up her crayon drawing in court, the judge froze mid-gavel, and the shocking truth no one saw coming unraveled before the entire town. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The morning sunlight filtered through the worn curtains of the Miller's small kitchen, casting a warm glow on the faded linoleum floor. Frank Miller stood at the old stove, carefully watching the eggs as they scrambled in the pan. His weathered hands, marked by years of hard work, gripped the wooden spatula with gentle precision. "Almost ready, sweetheart," he called over his shoulder to Emily, who sat at their scratched kitchen table, swinging her legs back and forth. She was already dressed for school in her favorite blue jumper, her dark hair neatly braided. "Can I have extra pepper on mine, Daddy?" Emily asked, clutching her favorite red crayon. A half-finished drawing lay before her on the table. Frank smiled, the corners of his eyes crinkling. "Of course you can, sunshine." He reached for the pepper shaker, giving her portion an extra shake just the way she liked it. The toaster popped, making Emily giggle. Frank divided the eggs onto 2 mismatched plates, adding the slightly burnt toast. It wasn't much, but it was the best he could do. The stack of bills by the telephone caught his eye. Electric, water, mortgage, all stamped with red final notice. His stomach tightened, but he pushed the worry aside. "Here we go," Frank said, setting the plates down. He lowered himself into the creaky chair across from Emily, his joints protesting the movement. The Vietnam War had left its mark on his body, though he never complained. Emily immediately picked up her fork, scooping up a big bite of eggs. You make the best eggs, Daddy." "Well, thank you, sweetheart. That's quite a compliment from my favorite food critic." Frank watched her eat, his own appetite diminished by his worries. But he forced himself to take a bite, knowing Emily would notice if he didn't eat. "Look what I'm drawing." Emily pushed her paper across the table. It showed 2 stick figures, holding hands, one tall with gray hair, one small with pigtails, standing in front of what looked like the community center where Frank volunteered. "That's beautiful, Em. Is that us at the center?" Emily nodded enthusiastically. "That's where you help people. Mrs. Johnson told me yesterday that you're the nicest person there." Frank felt his chest tighten with emotion. The community center had become his second home since losing his wife, Emily's grandmother, 3 years ago. Helping others gave him purpose, even if the volunteer work didn't help pay the bills. "Well, Mrs. Johnson is very kind," he said, taking another bite of toast. "Speaking of the center, I need to stop by there this afternoon after I pick you up from school. We're organizing the food pantry for—" A sharp knock at the door cut him off. Frank frowned, checking the clock on the wall. 7:15 a.m. Too early for casual visitors. "Who's that, Daddy?" Emily asked, pepper-speckled eggs forgotten. "I'm not sure, sunshine. Stay right there and finish your breakfast." Frank pushed back from the table, his chair scraping against the floor. The knocking came again, more insistent this time. Frank made his way to the front door, his bad knee twinging with each step. Through the peephole, he saw 2 police officers standing on his worn welcome mat. Frank's heart began to race, but he kept his voice steady as he opened the door. "Can I help you, officers?" "Frank Miller?" the taller officer asked, his face stern. "Yes, that's me. I'm Officer Roberts. This is Officer Chen. We need you to come with us." Frank's mouth went dry. "What's this about? Daddy?" Emily's small voice came from behind him. He turned to see her standing in the kitchen doorway, clutching her crayon. Officer Roberts cleared his throat. "Mr. Miller, you're under arrest for embezzlement of funds from the Riverside Community Center." The words hit Frank like a physical blow. "What? There must be some mistake." "Turn around and put your hands behind your back, please," Officer Chen interrupted, already reaching for his handcuffs. "No!" Emily cried, running forward. "My daddy didn't do anything wrong." Frank's mind raced. The community center? Embezzlement? It was impossible. He had to stay calm, for Emily's sake. "Please, officers, my daughter." "Hands behind your backs, sir," Officer Roberts repeated more firmly. Frank complied, his movements mechanical. The cold metal of the handcuffs clicked around his wrists as Emily began to sob. "Daddy!" She rushed forward, wrapping her arms around his leg. "Don't take my daddy, Emily, sweetheart. It's going to be okay," Frank said, trying to keep his voice steady despite the terror gripping his heart. "Mrs. Parker next door will watch you until Aunt Sarah can come. Everything's going to be fine." Officer Chen stepped forward. "We'll make sure the neighbor is notified." "No," Emily screamed again, holding tighter to Frank's leg. "Don't take him! He didn't do anything bad! He helps people!" Frank wanted nothing more than to hold his daughter, to wipe away her tears, but his hands were bound behind him. "Emily, please, you need to let go. I'll be home soon, I promise." "Mr. Miller, we need to go," Officer Roberts said, though his voice had softened slightly at the sight of Emily's distress. Mrs. Parker appeared in the doorway, likely drawn by the commotion. Her eyes widened at the scene before her. "Frank, what's happening?" "Sarah, please," Frank managed, nodding toward Emily, who was still clinging to his leg and sobbing. "Call her aunt." Mrs. Parker hurried forward, gently trying to pry Emily away. "Come here, sweetie. Let's call Aunt Sarah together." "No! Daddy, Daddy!" Emily's screams echoed through the small house as the officers began leading Frank toward the door. Her desperate cries tore at his heart, making his steps falter. "I love you, sunshine," he called over his shoulder, fighting to keep his voice from breaking. "Be good for Mrs. Parker. I'll be home soon." The last thing Frank saw as the officers led him away was Emily's tear-stained face, her small hands reaching for him as Mrs. Parker held her back. On the kitchen table, her unfinished drawing lay forgotten, next to 2 plates of cold eggs and toast. Their simple breakfast turned into a moment he knew would haunt him forever. The stark fluorescent lights buzzed overhead in the county jail's holding cell as Frank Miller sat on the cold metal bench, his head in his hands. His mind raced, trying to make sense of how his ordinary morning had turned into this nightmare. The orange jumpsuit they'd given him felt alien against his skin, so different from his usual worn work clothes. "I didn't take that money," he muttered to himself for the 100th time, his voice barely a whisper in the empty cell. The community center's missing funds. How could anyone think he'd steal from a place he'd poured his heart into for years? Meanwhile, in the courthouse's bustling corridor, Sarah Bennett held Emily close, stroking the little girl's hair as they waited outside the courtroom. Emily's small frame trembled against her aunt's navy blue nurse's uniform, her favorite box of crayons clutched tightly to her chest. "Aunt Sarah," Emily's voice quivered. "Why are they being mean to Daddy? He helps people. He always helps people." Sarah swallowed hard, fighting back her own tears. The fluorescent lights above cast harsh shadows across her tired face. She'd come straight from her night shift at the hospital when she got the call about Frank's arrest. "I know he does, sweetie," she said softly, adjusting Emily's rumpled jumper. "That's why we're here, to tell them the truth about your daddy." The courthouse corridor buzzed with whispered conversations. Several people from their small town had shown up for the preliminary hearing, some wearing concerned expressions, others shaking their heads in disappointment. Sarah noticed Mrs. Henderson from the grocery store pointing and whispering to another woman. The gossip had already started. "But why won't they let me see him?" Emily's lower lip trembled as she pulled out a wrinkled piece of paper from her pocket, a crayon drawing she'd been working on all morning while waiting. Sarah looked at the drawing, her heart clenching. In Emily's childish style, it showed Frank at the community center, stick figures of people lined up as he handed out brown squares that must have been food boxes. Even in crayon, the love and pride in the drawing was unmistakable. "The judge needs to talk to Daddy first," Sarah explained, trying to keep her voice steady. "Then we'll—" She stopped mid-sentence as Emily suddenly squirmed out of her grasp. "Emily, wait!" Sarah called out, but the little girl had already slipped through the heavy courtroom doors that someone had just opened. Inside the courtroom, Judge Thompson sat behind his imposing desk, his gray eyebrows furrowed as he reviewed the preliminary documents. Frank stood at the defendant's table, his shoulders slumped but his head held high. His court-appointed attorney shuffled papers beside him, looking harried. "Your Honor," the prosecutor was saying, "the evidence clearly shows that $50,000 is missing from the community center's accounts, and Mr. Miller had direct access to— Daddy doesn't take things that aren't his." Emily's clear voice rang out through the courtroom. Everyone turned to stare as the little girl marched determinedly down the center aisle, her Mary Janes clicking against the polished floor. "Young lady," Judge Thompson began sternly, but Emily was already pulling her drawing from her pocket, holding it up high above her head with both hands. "Look," she declared, her voice trembling but determined. "This is what my daddy really does. He gives food to people who are hungry. He helps Mrs. Rodriguez carry her groceries up the stairs when her back hurts. He fixes Mr. Wilson's wheelchair when it gets stuck." Frank's eyes filled with tears as he looked at his daughter. "Emily," he whispered, half rising from his chair before his attorney gently pulled him back down. Sarah appeared in the doorway, slightly out of breath. "I'm so sorry, Your Honor. Emily, come here right now." But Judge Thompson held up his hand, his stern expression softening as he studied the crayon drawing Emily still held high. The simple lines showed what looked like a food distribution line at the community center with a tall stick figure, clearly Frank, handing out boxes to smiling people. The courtroom remained absolutely silent as the judge leaned forward in his chair, adjusting his glasses. His gavel, which he'd been about to bring down, remained suspended in midair. The harsh fluorescent light seemed to soften as they fell across Emily's earnest face and her colorful drawing. "Your Honor," Emily said in a smaller voice now, but still clear enough to carry through the hushed courtroom, "my daddy always says helping people is the most important thing we can do. He wouldn't take anything from the community center. That's where he helps people the most." Judge Thompson's hand, still gripping the gavel, remained frozen. His eyes moved from the drawing to Emily's face, then to Frank, who stood straight now, dignity evident in his bearing despite his prison jumpsuit. For a moment, the only sound in the courtroom was the soft whirring of the ceiling fan and Emily's slight sniffle as she continued to hold her drawing up high. The judge's expression, usually so stern and unreadable, flickered with something that looked remarkably like compassion. The wooden gavel remained suspended, catching the morning light that streamed through the high courthouse windows, as if justice itself had paused to consider the simple truth in a child's crayon drawing. Frank's weathered hands trembled slightly as his court-appointed lawyer, Mr. Peters, leaned in close. The small courtroom buzzed with whispered conversations, the wooden benches creaking as people shifted in their seats. Afternoon sunlight filtered through tall windows, casting long shadows across the worn carpet. "The judge seems moved by your daughter's drawing," Mr. Peters whispered, his wire-rimmed glasses catching the light. "I think we might have a shot at bail after all." Frank's eyes drifted to Emily, who sat in the front row next to Sarah. His daughter's small fingers still clutched her crayon drawing, her face bright with hope. The sight of her made his chest tight with emotion. Judge Thompson cleared his throat, silencing the room. His stern expression had softened somewhat as he studied Emily's artwork, which now lay on his desk. "Given the circumstances," he began, his deep voice carrying authority but also a hint of warmth, "I'm inclined to reconsider the matter of bail." Sarah squeezed Emily's shoulder, and Frank felt a surge of gratitude for his sister-in-law's steady presence. She'd been his rock since Marie passed, helping with Emily while working long hours as a nurse. The bailiff gestured for Frank to approach Emily. His chains clinked as he walked forward, but he managed to kneel before his daughter, her small arms wrapped around his neck, and he breathed in the familiar scent of her strawberry shampoo. "See, sweetheart," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. "The truth shines." Emily's face lit up with a gap-toothed smile. "I told them, Daddy. I showed them how you help people." Frank held her tighter, fighting back tears. The simple truth in her drawing, showing him handing out food boxes at the community center, had done more than his words ever could. "Your Honor," Prosecutor Dana Harris's sharp voice cut through the moment. She stood at her table, a manila folder in her manicured hands. "Before you make your decision, the state has new evidence to present." Judge Thompson's expression hardened. "Proceed, Miss Harris." The prosecutor's heels clicked against the floor as she approached the bench. "We've just received these bank statements from First National." She handed copies to the judge, and Mr. www. Peters. "They show regular transfers from the community center's account to an offshore account registered to Mr. Miller." A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. Frank's stomach dropped as he stood, still holding Emily's hand. "That's impossible," he said, loud enough for the judge to hear. "I've never had an offshore account in my life." Mr. Peters frantically flipped through the papers, his forehead creasing. "Your Honor, we haven't had time to verify these documents. The bank's authentication appears legitimate," Prosecutor Harris interrupted, her voice clinical. "Over $50,000 has been systematically siphoned from the community center's food bank fund over the past year." Frank felt the room spinning. Emily's small hand tightened around his fingers as worried murmurs filled the courtroom. He looked down at his daughter's confused face, his heart breaking at her worried expression. Judge Thompson studied the documents, his earlier warmth completely gone. "These are serious allegations, Mr. Miller. With this new evidence, I cannot in good conscience grant bail." His gavel cracked against the wooden block. "The defendant will remain in custody until trial." "No!" Emily's cry pierced the air. She clung to Frank's leg as the bailiff approached. "Daddy didn't take anything. He helps people." Sarah rushed forward, gently pulling Emily back as the bailiff took Frank's arm. "It's okay, baby," Frank managed to say, though his voice cracked. "It's going to be okay." Emily buried her face in Sarah's skirt, her small shoulders shaking with sobs. "But Daddy didn't do it," she wailed, her voice muffled against the fabric. Sarah held Emily close, her own eyes glistening with tears as she watched the bailiff lead Frank away. The prosecutor gathered her papers, her face expressionless, while Mr. Peters stood at the defense table, still staring at the bank statements in disbelief. "Court is adjourned," Judge Thompson announced, but his eyes lingered on Emily's drawing still lying on his desk. For a moment, uncertainty flickered across his stern features. As Frank was led through the side door, he caught one last glimpse of Emily clutching Sarah's hand, tears streaming down his daughter's face. The sight burned into his memory, his little girl's world, crumbling because of lies he couldn't explain. The heavy courtroom door closed behind him with a final, echoing thud. In the holding area, Frank heard Emily's distant cries growing fainter, and each sob felt like a physical blow. The cold metal of the handcuffs bit into his wrists, but the pain was nothing compared to the agony of seeing his daughter's faith in him tested so cruelly. The bailiff guided him toward the corridor leading back to the jail cells. Frank's footsteps dragged, each step taking him further from Emily, from the truth, from everything he'd worked so hard to build. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed mercilessly, casting harsh shadows that seemed to mock the warmth of the afternoon sunshine he'd felt just moments before. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead in the county jail's visiting area, casting a harsh glow that made everything look pale and washed out. Sarah Bennett guided Emily through the security checkpoint, her nurse's ID badge clipped neatly to her sweater. Emily clutched her latest drawing close to her chest, the paper crinkling softly against her pink t-shirt. "Remember what I told you, sweetie," Sarah said quietly, squeezing Emily's small hand. "We have to stay calm and brave for Daddy, okay?" Emily nodded, her pigtails bouncing. "I made him another picture. Do you think they'll let me give it to him?" Sarah's heart clenched. "No, honey, we can only show it through the glass. But I'm sure seeing it will make him very happy." The guard, a heavy-set woman with kind eyes, led them to one of the visiting booths. Emily climbed onto the hard plastic chair, her feet dangling above the floor. Her eyes widened when she saw the thick glass partition separating them from the other side. "Why is there glass?" Emily whispered to Sarah. "I want to hug Daddy." Sarah settled into the chair beside her niece. "I know, sweetheart, but these are the rules. We can still talk to him through the phone." They waited, Emily's small fingers tracing patterns on the scratched counter surface. When Frank appeared on the other side, Emily gasped. The orange jumpsuit made him look different, smaller somehow, despite his tall frame. His silver hair was messy, and dark circles shadowed his eyes. "Daddy." Emily pressed her hands against the glass, her voice wobbling. Frank's face lit up at the sight of his daughter, though Sarah could see how much effort it took. He lowered himself into the chair and picked up the phone on his side. Sarah helped Emily hold their receiver. "There's my sunshine," Frank said, his voice scratchy through the connection. He placed his free hand against the glass, matching Emily's smaller one. Are you being good for Aunt Sarah? Emily nodded vigorously. I made you another picture, Daddy. Look. She held up her drawing. A colorful scene showing Frank at the community center, surrounded by smiling stick figures. See, that's you giving Mrs. Johnson her special diet food, and that's Mr. Pete getting his medicine money, and that's— Her voice cracked, and tears spilled down her cheeks. Frank pressed his forehead against the glass, his own eyes glistening. It's beautiful, sweetheart, he managed. Just beautiful. Sarah wrapped an arm around Emily's shoulders. Frank, how are you holding up? He tried to smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. Oh, you know me, Sarah. Tough as old boots. He cleared his throat. The food's not as good as my cooking, though. Emily wiped her nose with her sleeve. When are you coming home, Daddy? I don't like eating breakfast without you. Frank's facade cracked for just a moment, pain flashing across his face before he could hide it. I don't know yet, sunshine. The grown-ups need to figure some things out first. But you didn't do anything wrong. Emily's voice rose, drawing glances from other visitors. You help people. You're good. Shh, Emily, Sarah soothed, but Frank shook his head. It's okay, he said softly. Let her speak her truth. Emily pressed her drawing against the glass. See? I drew the truth, Daddy. Why won't they believe it? Frank's hand trembled slightly as he touched the glass where the drawing was. Sometimes grown-ups forget how to see the truth as clearly as children do. He took a shaky breath. But the truth always comes out in the end. We just have to be patient. Sarah noticed the guard signaling that their time was almost up. Emily, honey, we need to wrap up soon. Emily's lower lip trembled. But we just got here. I know, sunshine, Frank said gently. But you can come back soon. And maybe bring me another one of your wonderful drawings? Emily nodded, tears falling faster now. She pressed closer to the glass, her breath fogging it slightly. I'll draw lots and lots of pictures, and I'll show everyone the truth. Frank's composure slipped again, and he had to take a moment before speaking. You're so brave, my girl, so brave. The guard approached, indicating it was time to leave. Sarah stood, helping Emily to her feet. The little girl clutched the phone tighter, not wanting to let go. Daddy, she whispered, her voice small but determined through the receiver. I'll prove you're innocent, Daddy. Frank smiled weakly, drawing strength from her unwavering faith. The smile held love, pride, and a touch of heartbreak all at once. His fingers remained pressed against the glass, matching Emily's, until the guard gently led them away. Morning sunlight streamed through Sarah Bennett's kitchen window, painting warm squares on the worn linoleum floor. Emily sat at the round oak table, her small fingers wrapped tightly around her favorite blue crayon. Scattered around her were sheets of white paper, each one waiting to tell a story about her father. Sarah moved slowly around her kitchen, the weight of yesterday's events hanging heavy on her shoulders. Her scrubs from last night's hospital shift were still in the laundry basket, and dark circles rimmed her eyes. The coffee maker gurgled and hissed, promising a much-needed boost of energy. Aunt Sarah? Emily's voice was soft but determined. Can I have more paper, please? Sarah reached into the drawer near the refrigerator, pulling out a fresh stack. Of course, sweetheart. She set them down next to Emily's growing collection of drawings. Would you like some breakfast? I can make pancakes. Emily shook her head, already focused on her new piece of paper. Not hungry, she mumbled, switching to a brown crayon. I need to show everyone what Daddy does. Sarah watched as Emily's small hand moved across the paper with purpose. Stick figures began to take shape. One taller figure with gray hair that could only be Frank, surrounded by smaller figures with smiling faces. In the background, Emily drew the brick building of their community center, complete with its crooked weather vane that Frank had promised to fix. The coffee maker beeped, and Sarah poured herself a cup, adding an extra spoonful of sugar. She hadn't slept well, her mind replaying the shocking events of yesterday. Frank in handcuffs, those damning bank statements, Emily's tears against the visitor room glass. She took a long sip, letting the warmth spread through her chest. Look! Emily held up her latest creation. This is Daddy giving Mrs. Rodriguez soup when she was sick. The crayon figures showed Frank carrying a large pot, while a woman with curly hair sat in what appeared to be a bed. Sarah moved closer, studying the drawing. She remembered that day clearly. Frank had spent hours making his special chicken soup for their elderly neighbor who had the flu. "That's beautiful, Emily. You've captured it perfectly." Emily beamed and reached for her green crayon. "I'm going to draw the playground next. Remember when Tommy hurt his knee and Daddy fixed the swing that broke?" "I remember," Sarah said softly, pulling out a chair to sit beside her niece. The memory was vivid. Frank spending his entire Saturday replacing the rusty chains and weathered seat, refusing to leave until he'd tested it himself. Emily worked intently, her tongue poking out slightly in concentration. The playground took shape under her careful hands, swings, slides, and the big oak tree that provided shade for tired parents. Frank's figure stood by the swings, toolbox in hand, while happy children played nearby. "He always fixes things," Emily said, adding a yellow sun in the corner. "And he never asks for money. That's why I know he didn't take any." Sarah's heart clenched. She reached out to smooth Emily's hair, noticing it needed brushing. "Your daddy is a good man," she agreed, fighting to keep her voice steady. Emily nodded and started her next drawing. This one showed the inside of their small church, rows of wooden pews, the cross on the wall, and Frank kneeling in prayer. She added other people too, showing how her father would pray with anyone who asked, staying long after services ended. "Pastor Mike says Daddy has the biggest heart in town," Emily commented, carefully coloring the stained glass windows with every crayon in her box. "He says Daddy's like a guardian angel." Sarah watched as more drawings appeared. Frank helping Mr. Chen carry boxes into his new store. Frank shoveling snow from Mrs. Watson's driveway. Frank organizing the food bank during Thanksgiving. Each picture was simple but powerful in its truth, showing the countless ways her brother-in-law had woven himself into the fabric of their community. The morning light grew stronger, and Sarah realized she'd finished her coffee without noticing. Emily had created a small gallery on the table, each drawing a testament to Frank's character. There were at least 10 of them now, filled with bright colors and even brighter memories. "Can we show these to people?" Emily asked, arranging her artwork in a neat row. "Maybe if they see what Daddy really does, they'll know he's good." Her blue eyes shone with hope and determination, so much like her mother's that it made Sarah's chest ache. Looking at the drawings spread across her kitchen table, Sarah felt tears prick at her eyes. Each crayon sketch told a story of kindness, of sacrifice, of a man who had given everything to his community and asked nothing in return. How could anyone believe Frank capable of stealing? Emily stood up on her chair, gathering her drawings with careful hands. "These will show everyone who my daddy really is," she declared proudly, holding them close to her heart. Sarah rose from her chair and wrapped her arms around Emily, drawing her into a tight hug. Her emotions warred within her. Hope that Emily's pure faith might somehow pierce through the darkness surrounding Frank's case, and fear that the world might prove too harsh for such innocent belief. She held her niece close, feeling the drawings press between them like precious treasures. Through the kitchen window, birds sang their morning songs, oblivious to the human drama unfolding below. The coffee maker dripped its last drops, and somewhere in the distance, a church bell chimed the hour. In Sarah's kitchen, a little girl's love for her father had been transformed into colorful truth on paper, waiting to be shared with a world that desperately needed to see it. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the community center's brick walls as Sarah helped Emily pin her drawings to the large cork notice board. The board, usually cluttered with yard sale notices and lost pet flyers, was being transformed into a gallery of childhood memories. Emily stood on a wooden chair, carefully positioning each drawing at what she considered the perfect height, her face scrunched in concentration as she smoothed out a wrinkled corner. "Do you think people will stop to look, Aunt Sarah?" "I'm sure they will, sweetheart." Sarah secured another drawing with a bright red pushpin. This one showed Frank organizing boxes of canned goods during last winter's food drive. Even in crayon, his kind smile was unmistakable. Mrs. Thompson from the bakery across the street was the first to notice. She paused on her way home, paper bag of day-old bread tucked under her arm. Her eyes moved from drawing to drawing, lingering on the one showing Frank fixing her store's broken window after a storm. "Oh my," Mrs. Thompson whispered, stepping closer. "I remember that day." Frank wouldn't take a penny for his work. She reached out, her fingers hovering near the crayon marks. "He said good neighbors help each other." Emily beamed at the baker's words. "Daddy always helps people." She pointed to another drawing. "See? That's when he fixed Mr. Chen's delivery truck." More people began to gather. Mr. Rodriguez from the hardware store stopped to look, his work apron still dusted with sawdust. The Chen family paused on their evening walk, their young son Tommy pointing excitedly at a drawing that showed him playing on the repaired swing set. But not everyone shared the warm smiles. Mrs. Green, who worked at the bank, pursed her lips and shook her head. "Such a shame," she muttered to her friend, "all that kindness and then to steal." Their whispers carried just far enough for Emily to hear. Sarah's hand tightened protectively on Emily's shoulder. "Don't listen to them, honey. Keep putting up your drawings." Emily nodded bravely, though her lower lip trembled slightly. She reached into her folder for another picture. This one, showing Frank leading a prayer circle after old Mr. Wilson lost his wife. The crayon figures held hands in a rainbow-colored ring. "I remember that prayer circle," a deep, warm voice said from behind them. "Your father's words brought comfort to many hearts that day." Pastor Jenkins stood there, his kind eyes taking in the display of drawings. He was still wearing his dark suit from afternoon counseling sessions, his silver hair catching the sunlight. The whispers around them quieted as he stepped forward. "Emily," he said gently, kneeling beside her chair despite his formal clothes. "Would you tell me about your drawings?" Emily's face lit up. She pointed to each picture in turn, explaining the stories behind them with the earnest detail only a child could provide. The small crowd listened as she described how her father had spent 3 days helping the Wilsons move into their new apartment, how he'd organized the Christmas toy drive, how he stayed late at the community center to make sure everyone got a hot meal during the big snowstorm. Pastor Jenkins nodded at each story, his expression thoughtful. Mrs. Green and her friend shifted uncomfortably, their earlier whispers forgotten. "You know," Pastor Jenkins said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "I've known Frank Miller for 20 years. Not once has he asked for recognition or reward." He stood up slowly, addressing the gathered neighbors. "These drawings, they show us something pure and true. They show us the man we've all known, the man who has touched all our lives in some way." Mr. Chen stepped forward, nodding vigorously. "Frank, help me when truck break down, no charge. Say neighbors help neighbors. He fixed my roof last summer," Mr. Rodriguez added. "Wouldn't even let me buy him lunch." More voices joined in, sharing stories of Frank's kindness. Even Mrs. Thompson spoke up about the time Frank had helped her daughter's family with groceries when they'd fallen on hard times. Emily watched in wonder as her crayon drawings sparked memory after memory. Sarah squeezed her hand, tears glistening in her eyes. Pastor Jenkins turned back to Emily, his face serious but kind. "Your drawings tell a powerful truth, little one. They remind us who your father really is." He placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Would you let me help share these stories? Perhaps we could display them in the church as well." Emily's eyes widened. "Really? You'll help tell everyone about Daddy?" "Yes, I will." Pastor Jenkins smiled warmly. "Sometimes adults forget to look with the clear eyes of a child. Your drawings help us remember." The afternoon light was growing softer, casting orange and pink streaks across the community center's walls. The gathered neighbors lingered, studying the drawings, sharing more stories. What had started as curious glances had transformed into something more, a reminder of the bonds that connected them all, and the man who had helped forge those bonds through countless acts of kindness. Sarah watched as Emily and Pastor Jenkins discussed where to hang the drawings in the church. Her niece's face glowed with hope, her earlier hurt forgotten in the face of such support. The pastor's presence had changed something, turned doubt into reflection, whispers into spoken memories. Emily carefully pinned up her last drawing. This one showed the whole town, stick figures, holding hands around the community center, with Frank in the middle, his crayon smile radiating love to everyone around him. It was a child's vision of community, simple and pure, reminding them all of what really mattered. The morning sunlight filtered through the stained glass windows of First Community Church, casting rainbow patterns across the wooden pews. Emily sat between Sarah and Pastor Jenkins in the front row, her small legs swinging back and forth, unable to reach the floor. Her favorite yellow dress, the one with tiny daisies, rustled with each movement. "Look, Aunt Sarah," Emily whispered excitedly, pointing to the church's fellowship hall entrance. "My pictures." Pastor Jenkins had transformed the usually plain bulletin board into what he called Emily's Gallery of Love. Each of her crayon drawings was carefully mounted on colored construction paper, creating bright frames that made the artwork pop. Beneath each picture, the pastor had added small typed captions describing the scenes Emily had captured. Frank Miller, serving at the Christmas food drive. Mr. Miller fixing the playground swings. Our brother Frank leading the veterans' prayer group. As the congregation filed in for the morning service, people couldn't help but stop to look. Mrs. Martinez, who ran the food bank, wiped her eyes when she saw the drawing of Frank helping her unload boxes of donations. "Such a good man," she murmured, squeezing Emily's shoulder as she passed. Even grumpy old Mr. Peterson, who usually hurried straight to his usual back pew, paused to study the pictures. His weathered face softened as he recognized himself in one of the drawings, showing the day Frank had helped him repair his roof after the big storm. During his sermon, Pastor Jenkins stood tall in his pulpit, his deep voice carrying to every corner of the sanctuary. "Today, I want to talk about faith," he began, gesturing to the artwork. "Not just faith in God, but faith in each other. Look at these drawings. Through the eyes of a child, we see the truth of a man's character." Emily sat up straighter, proud as could be. Sarah squeezed her hand, fighting back tears. "Frank Miller," Pastor Jenkins continued, "has been a pillar of this community for decades. When someone needs help, Frank is there. When our veterans struggle, Frank listens. When our food bank runs low, Frank gives from his own modest means." Heads nodded throughout the congregation. Mrs. Wilson, the choir director, dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. Now, in his time of need, we must ask ourselves, what does our faith call us to do? The pastor's words hung in the air. Do we turn our backs on a brother who has never turned his back on us? After the service, people clustered around Emily's gallery. The buzz of conversations filled the fellowship hall. Emily stood near her drawings, explaining them to anyone who asked, her face glowing with purpose. "This is when Daddy fixed Tommy's bike," she told Mrs. Anderson, pointing to a particularly colorful drawing. "See, Tommy was crying because his chain broke, but Daddy made it all better." Tommy's mother nodded, remembering that day. "Your father wouldn't take a penny for his help," she recalled. Said seeing Tommy smile was payment enough. Sarah watched from nearby, serving coffee and cookies to the lingering congregants. Her heart swelled seeing how Emily's simple drawings were awakening memories throughout the community. Each picture seemed to unlock another story of Frank's quiet kindness. As the crowd began to thin, Pastor Jenkins approached with Mr. Rodriguez, who had served with Frank in Vietnam. "Sarah," the pastor said warmly, "some folks would like a word." Outside, under the shade of the old oak tree, a group of veterans had gathered. Most were Frank's age, wearing their Sunday best, some with military pins on their lapels. Mr. Rodriguez stepped forward, speaking for the group. "Ma'am," he began, his voice thick with emotion, "we served with Frank. Some of us owe him our lives." He glanced at his fellow veterans, who nodded solemnly. "That man carried me through 3 miles of jungle when I was hit. Never left a man behind, then or now." Another veteran, Colonel James, spoke up. "Frank Miller is one of the finest soldiers I ever knew. More than that, he's one of the finest men I've ever known. We're not about to leave him behind either." Sarah felt tears welling up as the veterans, one by one, pledged their support. They would help with legal fees, speak as character witnesses, do whatever it took to clear Frank's name. "Tell Frank," Mr. Rodriguez said, placing a hand on Sarah's shoulder. "His brothers have his back, just like always." Emily, who had followed them outside, looked up at the group of veterans with wide eyes. "You're going to help my daddy?" Colonel James knelt down to her level, his medals glinting in the sunlight. "Yes, sweetheart, your daddy helped all of us once. Now it's our turn to help him." The little girl threw her arms around the surprised colonel's neck. "Thank you," she whispered. "Daddy says veterans are family forever." The tough old soldier hugged her back, his eyes misty. "That's right, honey. Family forever." Sarah watched as Emily pulled away and reached into her small purse, taking out a folded piece of paper. It was another drawing, this one showing a group of men in uniform standing together. "I made this for you," she told the veterans. "It's Daddy's Army family." The simple crayon drawing passed from hand to hand among the veterans, each man touching it gently, as if it were a precious artifact. Finally, Mr. Rodriguez carefully folded it and placed it in his breast pocket, right over his heart. "We'll keep this safe," he promised Emily, "just like we're going to help keep your daddy safe." Sarah felt a surge of hope stronger than she'd experienced since Frank's arrest. These men, who had seen the worst of humanity in war but still believed in justice, were standing firm for Frank. Their unwavering loyalty, sparked by Emily's innocent artwork, seemed like the first real ray of light in this dark time. Pastor Jenkins, who had been quietly observing, placed a gentle hand on Emily's shoulder. "You see, little one? Sometimes God works through the smallest hands to move the mightiest hearts." Emily beamed up at him, then turned to watch the veterans discussing plans among themselves. Their determined faces and firm handshakes spoke of men who knew how to get things done, men who wouldn't rest until their brother was free. The county jail's visiting room was cold and stark, with gray concrete walls that seemed to absorb all warmth. Emily clutched her latest drawing close to her chest as she and Sarah waited in the hard plastic chairs. Her feet, in shiny black Mary Janes, barely reached the floor. "Remember, sweetie," Sarah said softly, smoothing Emily's hair, "we only have 20 minutes today." She checked her watch, the circles under her eyes darker than usual after another long night shift at the hospital. The heavy metal door buzzed, making Emily jump. Her face lit up as Frank shuffled in, wearing the orange jumpsuit that looked too big on his thin frame. His hands were cuffed in front of him, but his tired eyes sparkled when he saw his daughter. "There's my sunshine," he said, easing into the chair across the thick glass partition. Emily pressed her small hand against the barrier, and Frank matched it with his larger one on the other side. "Daddy, Pastor Jenkins put all my drawings up at church." Emily's words tumbled out in excitement. "Everyone could see them during the service yesterday." Frank's weathered face softened. "Is that right?" Sarah leaned forward, speaking into the phone receiver she shared with Emily. "It's true, Frank. Pastor Jenkins created quite a display in the fellowship hall. Called it Emily's Gallery of Love." She squeezed Emily's shoulder. "You should have seen how many people stopped to look. Some people cried, 'Daddy,'" Emily added. "But the good kind of crying, like when you're happy." Frank swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. That's something special, sweetheart." "And that's not all," Sarah continued. "After the service, a group of veterans approached us. They remember you from the VFW meetings, Frank. They're standing behind you." Frank's shoulders straightened slightly, some of the defeat leaving his posture. "Bill Thompson's group?" Sarah nodded. "Bill himself said he'd stake his Purple Heart on your innocence. They're organizing a support committee." "Oh, Bill," Frank muttered, shaking his head. "Still fighting for his brothers after all these years." Emily bounced in her seat. "And Mrs. Peterson from the center? She told everyone about how you fixed her car last winter when she couldn't afford the mechanic." A ghost of a smile crossed Frank's face. "Just changed her oil and rotated her tires. Wasn't much." "It was to her," Sarah said firmly. "Frank, people are starting to remember all the good you've done. They're questioning these ridiculous charges." Frank's eyes grew distant. "Still doesn't explain those bank statements they found." "We'll figure that out," Sarah assured him. "Your lawyer's working on it. Meanwhile, the community's rallying. The veterans are planning a fundraiser for your defense." Emily tugged at Sarah's sleeve. "Show Daddy what else happened." Sarah pulled out a folded newspaper from her purse. The local paper ran a small article about the drawings. "Look." She held it up to the glass. Frank leaned forward, squinting at the headline. "Child's art speaks volumes. Community questions veterans arrest. Frank's hands trembled slightly as he read. They didn't have to do all this. Yes, they did, Sarah insisted. Because it's the truth, Frank. Emily's drawings are showing people who you really are. Emily had been fidgeting with something in her lap. Now she held up her latest creation, pressing it against the glass. I made you a new one, Daddy! Frank blinked rapidly, studying the crayon drawing. There he was, carefully depicted in Emily's childlike style, standing on a ladder at the community center. His crayon self was fixing the broken window that had been damaged during last spring's hailstorm. See? Emily pointed with a small finger. That's when you stayed late to fix it so the rain wouldn't get in. And look, I drew Mr. Wilson holding the ladder for you. Frank's voice was husky. I remember that day. Mr. Wilson brought us both hot chocolate after we finished. You always fix things, Daddy, Emily said simply. That's what you do. Frank pressed his hand against the glass again, his eyes shining. You're my brave little girl. You know that? He held the drawing against his heart, right over the orange fabric of his jumpsuit. My brave, wonderful little girl. The guard's voice cut through the moment. 5 minutes. Sarah checked her watch again. We'll be back on Thursday, Frank. The lawyer wants to meet with you tomorrow about those bank records. Frank nodded, but his eyes stayed on Emily. You being good for your Aunt Sarah? She helps me with my homework every night, Emily said. And we say prayers for you before bed. That means the world to me, sunshine. Frank's voice grew thick. You keep drawing your pictures. They're helping more than you know. Emily nodded solemnly. I will, Daddy. I'm going to draw one of you coming home next. The guard called out again, and Frank slowly stood. You take care of each other, he said, looking between his daughter and sister-in-law. And thank Pastor Jenkins and the veterans for me. We will, Sarah promised, gathering their things. Emily pressed her face close to the glass. Love you to the moon and back, Daddy. Love you more than all the stars, sunshine. Frank touched the glass one last time, then turned away quickly, his shoulders shaking as the guard led him back through the heavy door. Emily watched until he disappeared, then looked up at Sarah. Daddy was crying happy tears too, wasn't he? Sarah hugged her close, her own eyes damp. Yes, sweetheart. Those were definitely happy tears. The community center buzzed with activity on a bright Tuesday morning. Dozens of townspeople milled about, carrying Emily's colorful drawings with careful hands, as if holding precious treasures. The walls, once bare and institutional, now bloomed with crayon-bright scenes of Frank Miller's good deeds. Sarah watched from near the entrance as Mrs. Henderson, the retired art teacher, used blue painter's tape to secure a drawing of Frank fixing the center's playground swings. Perfect height for the children to see, Mrs. Henderson said, stepping back to admire her work. Emily really captured his kind eyes, didn't she? Emily herself sat cross-legged at a small folding table near the center's bulletin board, bent over a fresh piece of paper. Her tongue poked out slightly as she concentrated, switching between a brown crayon and a green one. A small pile of completed drawings lay beside her, each one telling another story of her father's generosity. Look what I found in my wallet. Mr. Rodriguez, the grocery store owner, approached a card table where volunteers had set up a donation jar. He pulled out 3 crisp $20 bills. For Frank's Defense Fund, that man helped me unload deliveries every Tuesday for 3 years straight, never asked for a dime. The donation jar, already half full of bills and checks, sat beside a handmade sign reading, Help Free Frank Miller, an Innocent Man. Pastor Jenkins stood nearby, talking quietly with a group of Frank's fellow veterans. Their Vietnam Veterans Association patches gleamed on well-worn jackets. Emily, sweetheart, called Mrs. Baker from the church choir. Would you like some cookies? I baked them fresh this morning. She set down a plate piled with chocolate chip cookies next to Emily's drawings. Emily looked up, her face brightening. Thank you. She carefully wiped crayon dust from her hands before taking a cookie. These are Daddy's favorite kind. Sarah's heart squeezed at the present tense in Emily's voice, as if Frank were just away on a trip, not sitting in a jail cell. But Emily's unwavering faith had sparked something in their small town. People who'd initially whispered doubts about Frank now spoke up with stories of his kindness. "Remember when Frank organized that Christmas food drive?" Mrs. Thompson from the hardware store was saying to anyone who would listen. "Spent his own money on turkeys for families who couldn't afford them." The center's director, Mr. S. Phillips, moved through the crowd with a clipboard, making notes. "The defense fund is growing faster than we hoped," he told Sarah quietly. "People are really stepping up." Emily had become something of a celebrity in their small town. Children from her first-grade class stopped by with their parents, giving her shy waves and words of encouragement. Her teacher, Miss Roberts, had even given her extra credit for using her art to help others. "Such a brave little girl," people would murmur as they passed, patting Emily's head or squeezing her shoulder. Emily accepted their attention with simple grace, more focused on her mission than the praise. Near noon, a man neither Sarah nor anyone else recognized slipped through the front doors. He wore jeans and a plain brown jacket, casual clothes that somehow seemed stiff and unfamiliar on his frame. His gray hair was partially hidden under a baseball cap, but there was something about his bearing that commanded attention. The man moved slowly around the room, hands clasped behind his back, studying each drawing with intense concentration. He paused longest at a picture showing Frank praying in church, then another of him serving soup to homeless veterans. Emily, taking a break from her drawing, wandered over to where the man stood. "That's my daddy," she said matter-of-factly, pointing to a figure in one of her pictures. "He's helping Mr. Wilson fix his wheelchair. The wheel was squeaky." The man turned slightly, looking down at Emily. His stern features softened almost imperceptibly. "You drew all these?" he asked, his voice gentle despite its natural gravity. Emily nodded. "I'm showing everyone what Daddy really does. He helps people. He doesn't steal." The man knelt down to Emily's level, his movements careful and deliberate. "Tell me about this one," he said, indicating a drawing of Frank surrounded by garden tools. "That's Daddy planting flowers at the center," Emily explained. "He said pretty things help sad people feel better." She looked at the man with clear, honest eyes. "Do you believe my daddy is good?" The man was quiet for a long moment. Something shifted in his expression, a crack in what seemed like years of professional distance. "Your drawings tell a very powerful story," he said finally. Sarah, watching from across the room, suddenly realized who the man was. Her heart skipped a beat as she recognized Judge Thompson without his usual robes and formal demeanor. But she held back, sensing this was a moment that shouldn't be interrupted. Emily beamed at the man's words. "Would you like to see my new drawing? I'm not finished yet, but it's Daddy fixing the broken window at the center. He cut his hand doing it, but he said it was important to keep the rain out." The judge nodded, rising slowly from his crouch. "I would like that very much." As Emily led him to her little table, Sarah noticed the judge's face had lost some of its habitual sternness. He stood watching as Emily explained her work in progress, his expression thoughtful and somehow younger than it had appeared in the courtroom. The afternoon light slanted through the community center's windows, casting warm rectangles on the floor. More people continued to arrive, adding to the growing buzz of conversation and the steady clink of donations in the jar. Emily's drawings watched over it all, silent testimonies to a father's love and a daughter's faith, their simple truths reaching even the most guarded of hearts. The aroma of garlic and tomato sauce filled Sarah's modest kitchen as she stirred the big pot of spaghetti. Through the steam rising from the stove, she watched Emily carefully setting the table, her small tongue poking out in concentration as she arranged 5 mismatched plates. "Need any help there, sweetheart?" Pastor Jenkins called from the doorway, his broad shoulders filling the frame. His warm presence always seemed to make any room feel cozier. "I got it," Emily declared proudly, standing on tiptoe to place the last fork. "But can you reach the fancy cups? The ones with flowers that Aunt Sarah keeps up high?" The pastor chuckled, easily retrieving the special occasion glasses from the top cabinet. Behind him, 2 veterans from Frank's old unit, Bill Thompson and Mike Rodriguez, entered carrying a fresh loaf of Italian bread and a tub of butter. "Something smells mighty fine, Sarah," Bill said, his weathered face creasing into a smile. He walked with a slight limp, a reminder of his own time in Vietnam. Reminds me of my mama's cooking. Well, I hope it tastes half as good as it smells, Sarah replied, trying to hide her exhaustion behind a warm smile. She'd worked a double shift at the hospital before rushing home to prepare dinner. Emily bounced over to Mike, tugging at his sleeve. Want to see my new drawings while we wait? I made one of Daddy helping you fix your car last summer. Mike's eyes softened as he followed Emily to the living room coffee table, where her ever-present sketchbook lay open. Lead the way, little artist. The kitchen filled with comfortable chatter as Sarah drained the pasta and Pastor Jenkins helped toss the salad. Bill arranged the bread in a basket, telling stories about Frank from their service days. The good ones, the ones that made them laugh, instead of haunting their dreams. When they finally gathered around the table, Pastor Jenkins said grace, his deep voice steady and reassuring. Lord, we thank you for this food and fellowship. We ask for your guidance and protection over our brother Frank, and we pray that truth and justice will prevail. Amen. Amen, they echoed, and Emily added hopefully. And please let Daddy come home soon. The simple meal turned into something special as they passed dishes around the cramped table. Emily sat between Mike and Bill, peppering them with questions about their memories of Frank. Her crayon moved across paper as she listened, capturing their stories in her unique way. Remember when your daddy organized that veterans food drive last Thanksgiving? Bill asked, twirling spaghetti around his fork. Must have been 30 families got proper holiday meals because of him. Emily nodded vigorously, adding a turkey to her drawing. He let me help pack the boxes. I got to put in all the cranberry sauce. That's right, Mike agreed, reaching for another slice of bread. Frank always said the best way to heal was to help others. Never saw him turn away anyone in need. Sarah watched her niece work, marveling at how the child captured not just what people looked like, but something of their essence. In Emily's latest drawing, they all sat around the table, but she'd drawn halos of yellow crayon around each person, like they were all touched by something special. May I see? Pastor Jenkins asked gently, and Emily proudly passed her sketchbook across the table. Now that's something beautiful, he said, studying the picture. You've got a gift for seeing the light in people, child. Just like her daddy, Sarah murmured, her throat tight with emotion. The evening wore on, plates emptied, and conversations drifted between hope and memory. Emily moved from chair to chair, adding details to her drawing. Bill's reading glasses, Mike's Marine Corps tattoo, Pastor Jenkins' kind smile, Sarah's nurse's watch. As the clock crept toward 8, Emily's eyes began to droop, her crayon moving slower across the page. She climbed into Sarah's lap, sketchbook clutched to her chest. Think it's about bedtime for our little artist, Bill said softly, standing to help clear the dishes. Mike nodded, gathering empty glasses. We'll get this cleaned up, Sarah. You just sit with her. Pastor Jenkins remained at the table as the veterans moved quietly around the kitchen. Emily's breathing grew deeper, more regular, her small body growing heavy against Sarah's chest. When she was sure Emily was asleep, Sarah met the pastor's concerned gaze. Jenkins, she whispered, careful not to wake her niece. I'm scared. The bank statements they found. They look so real. How can we fight that kind of evidence? The pastor leaned forward, his elbows on the table, his normally booming voice barely above a whisper. The truth is stronger than any piece of paper, Sarah. We just have to keep faith. But Sarah could hear the worry beneath his reassurance, matching her own fears that grew larger in the quiet evening hours. She held Emily closer, feeling the weight of both their futures resting on proving Frank's innocence. In the kitchen, water ran softly, as Bill and Mike washed dishes, their low voices mixing with the gentle domestic sounds. Emily stirred slightly in Sarah's arms, her sketchbook sliding to reveal the evening's drawing. Their little family of friends, bound together by love and loyalty, all of them glowing with that simple crayon light that Emily saw in everyone she loved. The morning sun streamed through Sarah's kitchen windows, catching dust motes in its golden rays. She stood at the sink, washing breakfast dishes, while Emily sat cross-legged on the living room floor, surrounded by her crayons and paper. The peaceful morning routine was interrupted by 3 sharp knocks at the front door. Sarah dried her hands on a dish towel and opened the door to find Harold Green standing there, his usually neat appearance somewhat disheveled. Dark circles under his eyes suggested sleepless nights. "Harold, what brings you by so early?" Sarah asked, keeping her voice low to avoid disturbing Emily. Harold shifted his weight uncomfortably. "Sarah, we need to talk. It's about Frank." His voice carried a heaviness that made Sarah's stomach tighten. She glanced back at Emily, who remained absorbed in her drawing, then stepped onto the front porch, pulling the door nearly closed behind her. The wooden boards creaked beneath their feet as Harold paced in small circles. "What is it?" Sarah crossed her arms against the morning chill. Harold ran a hand through his graying hair. "I've been carrying this weight for days now. I can't keep quiet anymore." He looked at her with pained eyes. "Frank did take that money, Sarah. I saw him." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. She grabbed the porch railing for support. "What are you talking about?" "One night, about 2 months ago, I went back to the center to grab some paperwork I'd forgotten. I saw Frank in the office." Harold's voice dropped to a whisper. "He was going through the donation records, acting real suspicious-like. When he saw me, he made up some excuse about organizing files." Sarah shook her head firmly. "No, Frank wouldn't." "Sarah, please." Harold held up his hands. "I've known Frank for years. It killed me to stay quiet this long, but seeing little Emily with all those drawings..." He trailed off, his voice thick with emotion. "The truth needs to come out." Inside the house, Emily hummed softly as she added color to her latest masterpiece, oblivious to the conversation that was shattering her world. Sarah's mind raced through countless memories of Frank's integrity, his unwavering honesty. But Harold had been his friend for decades, since before Emily was born. Why would he lie? "Have you told anyone else about this?" Sarah's voice trembled. "Just you for now." Harold looked down at his shoes. "But I'm planning to talk to the police today. It's the right thing to do." Sarah felt the morning's warmth drain away. She watched as Harold walked down the porch steps, his shoulders hunched as if carrying an immense burden. As his car pulled away, she remained frozen, trying to process this betrayal. The rest of the morning passed in a blur. Sarah's phone started ringing by lunchtime. First Pastor Jenkins, then Mrs. Wilson from the church, then others. Harold had spoken to more than just the police. The story spread through their small town like wildfire. "I just can't believe it," Mrs. Wilson's voice crackled through the phone. "Harold's always been such a good friend to Frank. If he says he saw something..." Sarah paced the kitchen, speaking in hushed tones. "We don't know anything for certain. But those bank documents? And now this?" Mrs. Wilson sighed heavily. "Maybe we were too quick to doubt the evidence." More calls followed. Each conversation carried the same undertone of disappointment and retreating support. Sarah watched through the window as someone took down the "Support Frank Miller" sign from their front yard. Emily sat at the kitchen table, coloring with less enthusiasm than usual. Her crayon moved slowly across the paper as Sarah's phone rang yet again. "Hello?" "Yes." I heard what Harold said. Sarah's voice cracked. She turned away, trying to hide her distress. "I don't know what to think anymore, Mary. Frank's always been..." A small sound made Sarah turn. Emily stood in the doorway, her latest drawing clutched to her chest, eyes wide with understanding. The crayon picture fluttered to the floor as tears welled up in her eyes. "I've got to go," Sarah whispered into the phone, hanging up quickly. But Emily had already fled to her room. Sarah found her curled up on her bed, surrounded by her drawings of Frank helping at the food bank, fixing the playground, and sharing Christmas gifts with needy families. "They don't believe Daddy anymore, do they?" Emily's small voice quivered. Sarah sat on the edge of the bed, reaching for words of comfort that wouldn't come. Emily pulled her drawings closer, as if they could shield her from the truth. "Maybe they don't believe Daddy anymore," Emily whispered, her tears falling onto the colorful pages that had once sparked so much hope. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the bedroom window, touching the scattered drawings with golden light. But the warmth couldn't reach the cold fear that had settled over the house as trust crumbled and doubt took root in the wake of Harold's devastating claims. Sarah's old station wagon pulled into the jail's parking lot, its tires crunching over loose gravel. Emily sat in the back seat, her drawing pad clutched tightly to her chest. Her usual excitement about visiting her father was missing today, replaced by a heavy silence that worried Sarah. "We're here, sweetheart," Sarah said softly, watching Emily in the rearview mirror. The little girl nodded, but didn't move. The guard at the entrance recognized them, his usual friendly smile dimming when he noticed Emily's subdued demeanor. "Go right ahead, Miss Bennet. Mr. Miller's waiting in visiting room 3. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as they walked down the long corridor. Emily's small hand felt cold in Sarah's grip. When they reached the visiting room, Sarah's heart clenched at the sight through the glass. Frank sat hunched over the metal table, his orange jumpsuit hanging loose on his frame. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, and his usually neat hair was unkempt. He looked up when they entered, trying to summon a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "There's my girl," he said through the phone receiver, his voice rough from lack of use. Emily climbed onto the chair but didn't reach for the phone on her side right away. Sarah picked up the receiver instead. "Hi, Frank. How are you holding up?" "Oh, you know me." He attempted a weak chuckle. 3 meals a day and a roof over my head. Can't complain." But his eyes told a different story, one of isolation and sleepless nights. Emily finally took the phone, but instead of her usual stream of stories and questions, she just stared at her father through the thick glass. Frank leaned forward, concern etching deeper lines around his eyes. "Princess, you okay?" he asked gently. Emily's lower lip trembled. "Harold said you did bad things, Daddy." Frank's face paled, his hands resting on the metal counter, curled into tight fists. Sarah could see him struggling to maintain composure. "Emily," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "you know me. You know your daddy's heart." "But everyone's taking down their signs," Emily continued, her voice small and uncertain. "Mrs. Wilson won't look at me anymore when we go to church." Frank pressed his palm against the glass, something he never did before. He'd always said it made him feel more trapped. "People!" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Sometimes people believe what's easier to believe, not what's true." Emily reached out, placing her tiny hand against the glass opposite her father's. The contrast was stark. His weathered, large hand against her small, perfect one, separated by an inch of cold glass. "I brought you a new drawing," she said, but without her usual enthusiasm. She pulled out a piece of paper from her pad. It showed Frank at the community center, but the colors were darker than her usual bright choices, and the figures looked sad. Frank studied it, blinking hard. "It's beautiful, sweetheart, just like all your drawings." "Can I still draw you things?" Emily asked, uncertainty making her voice waver. "Even if people don't want to look at them anymore?" "Oh, baby," Frank's voice cracked. "Your drawings are the brightest part of my day. They remind me of all the good things out there, waiting for us." Sarah watched as Emily tried to smile for her father, but it was a ghost of her usual bright grin. The visit continued in fits and starts of conversation, heavy with things unsaid. Frank kept glancing at Emily, as if trying to memorize her face, while Emily seemed to shrink smaller in her chair with each passing minute. When the guard announced visiting hours were ending, Emily pressed her hand against the glass one last time. "I love you, Daddy. I love you too, Princess. More than all the stars in the sky." Frank's voice was thick with emotion as he watched them leave, remaining seated until they were out of sight. The drive home was quiet. Emily stared out the window at the darkening sky, her drawing pad unopened in her lap. Sarah tried to start conversations, but Emily's responses were single words or small nods. At home, Emily didn't want dinner. She took her crayons and pad to the window seat, her favorite spot for drawing. The moon was rising, full and bright, casting silver light across her small figure. Sarah brought her a glass of milk and some cookies, setting them quietly beside her. "Maybe we could draw something together?" she suggested. Emily shook her head, still staring at the moon. "I want to draw by myself for a while." Sarah kissed the top of her head and stepped back, watching as Emily finally opened her pad. The little girl's hand moved slowly across the paper, but Sarah couldn't see what she was drawing. Hours passed. Sarah checked on Emily periodically, finding her in the same position each time, curled up in the window seat, her face illuminated by moonlight, crayons scattered around her. Close to midnight, Sarah went to tell Emily it was well past bedtime. She found her niece had finally fallen asleep, her head resting against the cool window glass. The drawing pad lay open on her lap, and in the moonlight, Sarah could see a single tear had fallen onto the page, creating a dark spot on the paper. Sarah stood there for a long moment, looking at Emily's sleeping face and the tear-stained drawing pad. The moon cast long shadows across the room, and somewhere in the distance, a train whistle sounded, low and lonely in the night. The morning sun cast long shadows through the courtroom's tall windows, but they couldn't match the darkness in Frank Miller's eyes. He shuffled in wearing an ill-fitting suit Sarah had brought him, his hands cuffed in front of him. The chains clinked softly with each step. Emily sat perfectly still in the front row, her small fingers wrapped tightly around her box of crayons. Her favorite drawing pad lay untouched in her lap. Sarah kept a protective arm around the little girl's shoulders, noticing how Emily's usual sparkle had dimmed to a worried stare. "All rise," the bailiff called out. The packed courtroom rustled as everyone stood. Judge Thompson entered, his robe sweeping behind him. Though his face remained stern, his eyes lingered for just a moment on Emily before he took his seat. "Be seated," he commanded. "We'll begin with opening statements. Miss Harris, you may proceed." Prosecutor Dana Harris rose smoothly from her chair, her navy suit crisp and professional. She moved to stand before the jury with practiced confidence, her heels clicking against the polished floor. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she began, her voice carrying clearly through the hushed room. "This case is about trust and betrayal. The evidence will show that Frank Miller, a man trusted by his community, systematically stole over $50,000 from the very center where he volunteered." Emily's lower lip trembled. Sarah squeezed her shoulder gently. "The bank records are clear," Harris continued, lifting the documents. "Multiple transfers were made from the community center's account to an offshore account in Mr. Miller's name. The timestamps show these transfers occurred during his volunteer shifts. The evidence is, quite simply, overwhelming." Frank sat at the defense table, his shoulders slumped. His attorney, Clark, shuffled through his papers nervously, his tie slightly askew. Emily watched her father's face, searching for the smile that usually made everything better. But today, his eyes stayed fixed on the table. "Furthermore," the prosecutor went on, "we have testimony from Harold Jenkins, a longtime friend of the accused, who will tell you about suspicious behavior he witnessed. Mr. Miller's financial troubles are well documented. He was desperate, ladies and gentlemen, desperate enough to steal from those who trusted him most." Sarah felt Emily stiffen beside her. The little girl's knuckles had gone white around her crayon box. "The prosecution will prove beyond any reasonable doubt that Frank Miller betrayed his community, abused his position of trust, and committed grand theft. The evidence will speak for itself." Harris gestured to the stack of bank documents on her table. "These records don't lie." As Harris returned to her seat, Clark rose slowly. His hands trembled slightly as he buttoned his jacket. The defense attorney glanced at Frank, then at Emily, before facing the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice less assured than the prosecutor's, "my client is an honorable man, a veteran who served his country, a father who—" "Objection," Harris interrupted. "Counsel is attempting to appeal to emotion rather than address the facts." "Sustained," Judge Thompson ruled. "Stick to the relevant details, Mr. Clark." Clark's face flushed. He tugged at his collar and started again. "The evidence against my client is circumstantial. We intend to show that these bank records could have been falsified. That—" "Objection?" Harris stood again. "Counsel is making unsubstantiated claims about evidence not yet presented." "Sustained." The judge's gavel cracked sharply. "Mr. Clark, please proceed with appropriate caution." Emily pressed closer to Sarah, her small body tense. Sarah noticed the little girl's eyes darting between her father and his nervous attorney. The contrast between Clark's uncertainty and Harris's confidence was painful to watch. Clark stumbled through the rest of his opening statement, speaking about reasonable doubt and presumption of innocence. But his words lacked conviction, and several jurors exchanged knowing looks. "The prosecution may call its first witness," Judge Thompson announced. Harris stood smoothly. "The state calls Barbara Chen, the community center's accountant." A middle-aged woman in glasses made her way to the witness stand. After being sworn in, she sat primly, hands folded in her lap. "Miss Chen," Harris began, "please tell the court when you first noticed the discrepancies in the center's accounts." "It was during our monthly audit in April," Chen replied clearly. "I found several unusual transfers that hadn't been authorized by the board." "And these transfers, where did they lead?" "To an account in the Cayman Islands." Chen adjusted her glasses. "When we traced it back, it was registered to Frank Miller." Emily's crayon box slipped from her fingers, clattering to the floor. Several heads turned at the sound. Frank half rose from his chair, instinctively wanting to help his daughter, but the bailiff's stern look made him sink back down. Sarah bent to retrieve the scattered crayons, but Emily didn't seem to notice. Her eyes were fixed on her father, filled with confusion and hurt. Harris displayed the bank statements on a large screen. "Miss Chen, could you walk us through these transactions?" As the accountant detailed each transfer, the jury members nodded grimly. Several wrote in their notebooks. Clark shifted uncomfortably in his chair, rifling through his papers as if searching for something that might help. "And, in your professional opinion," Harris concluded, "could these transfers have been made without someone having direct access to the center's computers?" "No," Chen stated firmly. "They would have required both physical access and knowledge of our security protocols." "And who had such access during the times these transfers were made?" "According to our logs, Frank Miller was the only volunteer present during all of these instances." The prosecutor turned to the jury with a satisfied smile. "No further questions, Your Honor." Clark rose slowly for cross-examination, his legal pad covered in crossed-out notes. "Miss Chen, isn't it possible that someone else could have used Mr. Miller's login credentials?" "Objection," Harris called out. "Speculation. Sustained." Clark's shoulders slumped further. "Miss Chen, did you ever actually see Mr. Miller making these transfers?" "No, but the timestamps." "Just yes or no, please." "No." "No further questions," Clark said quietly, returning to his seat. Emily watched her father's attorney sink into his chair, his face drawn with worry. The jury members exchanged knowing looks, their expressions grim, as they reviewed their notes. The morning sun had climbed higher now, but inside the courtroom, the shadows seemed darker than ever. Sarah held Emily closer as they watched Frank's shoulders cave inward, his head bowed under the weight of the evidence against him. His daughter's unused crayons lay scattered at her feet, like pieces of her broken faith. The judge called for a 15-minute recess, his gavel echoing through the tense courtroom. People shuffled out into the hallway, their whispers bouncing off the marble walls. Emily remained rooted to her spot on the wooden bench, her face scrunched in concentration. Sarah watched as her niece pulled out her worn box of crayons with trembling fingers. "Sweetheart, do you want to get some water?" she asked softly. Emily shook her head, her pigtails swaying. "No, Aunt Sarah. I have to draw something important." She selected a black crayon and began moving it across her paper with unusual intensity. The courthouse corridor buzzed with conversation, but Emily stayed focused on her task. Her small hand moved with purpose, adding details that made Sarah lean in closer. The community center's familiar outline took shape. The brick walls, the crooked weather vane, the old oak tree out front. But this wasn't one of Emily's usual cheerful drawings. The moon hung heavy in a dark sky, and a shadowy figure crept near the back door. Emily switched to a gray crayon, carefully drawing what looked like papers tucked under the figure's arm. "Emily?" Sarah's voice held a note of curiosity. "What are you drawing, sweetie?" Emily's crayon paused mid-stroke. "I couldn't sleep that night," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Remember when I had that bad cold? And you let me stay up late watching cartoons?" Sarah nodded, remembering the night 2 weeks before Frank's arrest. Emily had been running a fever, and they'd camped out in the living room with blankets and chicken soup. "I saw Mr. Harold," Emily continued, adding more details to the figure. "He was being sneaky, like when Tommy from my class tries to steal extra cookies at snack time." Her small fingers traced the outline she'd drawn. "He looked around lots of times, like he was scared someone would see him." Sarah's heart began to race. "You're sure it was Harold?" Emily nodded emphatically. "He was wearing his green jacket, the one with the shiny buttons. And he walks funny, remember? Like this." she demonstrated by tilting her shoulders in an exaggerated way, perfectly mimicking Harold's distinctive gait. The defense attorney, Clark, was standing near the water fountain, reviewing his notes with slumped shoulders. Sarah glanced between him and Emily's drawing, her mind racing. "Emily, honey, keep drawing. Show me everything you remember," Sarah encouraged, her voice steady despite her racing pulse. She watched as Emily added more details. The time on the community center's clock tower reading 11:45, the way Harold had jimmied the back door, even the manila envelope he'd carried. When Emily finished, she held up the drawing proudly. "See? That's when Mr. Harold was being sneaky. He didn't see me watching from our window." She pointed to a small figure she'd drawn in a house window across the street. "I was drinking my medicine, and I saw everything." Sarah's hands trembled as she studied the drawing. Emily had captured details that only someone who had actually witnessed the scene could know: the broken porch light that usually illuminated the center's back entrance, the position of Harold's car partially hidden behind Mrs. Johnson's hedge. "Emily, this is very important," Sarah said, kneeling down to meet her niece's eyes. "Why didn't you tell us about this before?" Emily's lower lip quivered. "I didn't know it was important. Mr. Harold is Daddy's friend. I thought maybe he was just doing work stuff." She twisted a crayon in her hands. "But then he said those mean things about Daddy." Sarah gathered the drawing carefully, her nursing instincts kicking in as she noted the precise details of the scene. The timeline matched perfectly with when the financial records had been altered. "Stay right here, with Pastor Jenkins," Sarah instructed, catching the pastor's eye and waving him over. He had been standing nearby, offering silent support throughout the morning's proceedings. Emily nodded solemnly, accepting a gentle hug from the pastor as he sat down beside her. Sarah clutched the drawing and made her way through the crowd toward Attorney Clark, who was still studying his legal pad with a furrowed brow. "Mr. Clark," Sarah called out, her voice urgent but controlled, "you need to see this." The defense attorney looked up, his tired eyes showing little hope. But as Sarah held out Emily's drawing, explaining what her niece had witnessed, his expression began to change. He studied the crayon marks intently, asking sharp questions about the date, the time, and Emily's vantage point. "She's certain about the time?" Clark asked, pointing to the clock tower in the drawing. "Emily's very particular about details," Sarah explained. "She remembers it was during the late cartoon show, and I can verify she was sick that night. I was up with her until after midnight." Clark's posture straightened, his earlier defeat giving way to focused energy. He pulled out his phone, quickly scrolling through documents. "The bank records show the transfers were made at midnight," he muttered. "And Harold's statement claims he was home all evening." "Emily never lies," Sarah said firmly. "And she couldn't have known to make this up. She drew this completely on her own just now." The attorney's eyes lit up with newfound purpose. "This could be exactly what we need." He held the drawing carefully, as if it were made of gold rather than crayon wax. A child's eyewitness account, completely unprompted, with verifiable details that contradict Harold's sworn statement. Sarah felt hope flutter in her chest for the first time since the morning session began. "How do we present this?" "I'll need to question Emily," Clark said, his mind clearly racing ahead to strategy. "But first, I'm going to cross-examine Harold in a way he won't expect. This drawing gives us the timeline we've been missing." The bailiff appeared at the courtroom door, calling everyone back inside. Sarah glanced at Emily, still sitting with Pastor Jenkins, her crayons now packed away. Her niece gave her a small wave, and Sarah marveled at how this child's simple act of drawing might change everything. Defense Attorney Clark's hands trembled slightly as he organized his notes during the recess's final moments. The courtroom filled back up, the wooden benches creaking under the weight of spectators. Emily's drawing lay carefully placed on the defense table, a child's crayon illustration that might change everything. Judge Thompson adjusted his glasses. "You may proceed, Mr. Clark." Clark stood, clearing his throat. "Your Honor, I'd like to recall Mr. Harold Green to the stand." Harold's confident stride faltered slightly as he made his way back to the witness box. He smoothed his tie, casting a quick glance at Frank before sitting down. "Mr. Green," Clark began, picking up Emily's drawing, "I'd like to show you something." He approached the witness stand, holding up the crayon artwork. "This is a drawing made by Emily Miller. She drew this just moments ago, during recess." Harold's face tightened. "What does a child's drawing have to do with anything?" "Emily," Clark continued, his voice growing stronger, "has drawn you at the community center, at night, when the building was closed." He turned the drawing to face the courtroom. Emily had captured a shadowy figure with Harold's distinctive gray hair hunched over the center's desk with papers scattered around him. "That's ridiculous," Harold scoffed. "It's just scribbles from a 6-year-old. "Your Honor," Clark addressed the judge, "Emily Miller has been present at the community center many times with her father. She often napped on the old couch in the office, while Mr. Miller completed his volunteer work. On the night of March 15th, she was there late, waiting for her aunt to pick her up." Sarah nodded from her seat, squeezing Emily's hand. "Mr. Green." Clark turned back to Harold. "Where were you on the night of March 15th? "I was home," Harold answered quickly. Too quickly. "Like I am every night." "Really?" Clark picked up a document. "Because we have security footage showing your car in the community center parking lot at 11:47 p.m. that night." Whispers rippled through the courtroom. Harold's collar suddenly seemed too tight as he tugged at it. I might have stopped by to pick up some paperwork." "After hours? When the building was closed?" Clark pressed. "Without logging your entry in the security book, as required by center policy?" Harold shifted in his seat. Beads of sweat appeared on his forehead. "I don't. I might have forgotten." Clark pulled out another document. "Mr. Green, are you aware that your signature appears on several bank documents authorizing fund transfers from the community center's accounts?" "Of course," Harold replied. "I'm authorized to make such transfers." "Indeed." Clark nodded, then produced another paper. "And this is your signature as well?" He held up a document dated March 15th. Harold squinted at it. "Yes, that's mine." "Interesting." Clark turned to his table and picked up a third document. "Because this is your actual signature card from the bank, showing your true signature. Would you care to explain the discrepancies?" The courtroom fell silent. Harold's face had gone pale. There must be some mistake." "No mistake, Mr. Green." Clark's voice grew firmer. "We've had these analyzed by a forensic handwriting expert. The signatures on the transfer documents are forgeries." The prosecutor stood. "Objection, Your Honor. This evidence wasn't submitted during discovery." "Your Honor," Clark responded, "these documents were only obtained this morning after Emily's drawing prompted a new line of investigation. The bank rushed the verification process given the circumstances." Judge Thompson leaned forward. "I'll allow it. Continue, Mr. Clark." Clark pulled out more papers. "Mr. Green, are you familiar with these?" He laid them on the witness stand. "They're records of your personal debts, gambling debts to be precise, totaling almost exactly the amount missing from the community center's accounts." Harold's composure cracked. His hands shook as he stared at the documents. The courtroom seemed to close in around him. "Would you like to revise your earlier testimony?" Clark asked quietly. Harold's shoulders slumped. I needed the money," he whispered. "The dealers were threatening me. I thought I could pay it back before anyone noticed." Gasps echoed through the courtroom. Frank sat stunned, staring at the man he'd considered a friend for decades. "And Mr. Miller?" Clark pressed. "Why frame him? He was always there," Harold's voice cracked. "Always helping everyone, never asking for anything. I knew people would believe he might have taken the money to help others. And his signature was easy to forge. I'd seen it so many times on volunteer forms." The prosecutor stood up, his face grim. "Your Honor, in light of this new evidence, the state moves to dismiss all charges against Frank Miller." Two court officers approached the witness stand as Judge Thompson nodded gravely. "Mr. Green, you are hereby remanded into custody pending charges of theft, fraud, and perjury." As the officers led Harold away, he caught Frank's eye. "I'm sorry," he mumbled, but Frank just turned away, pulling Emily close as she ran to him. The courtroom erupted in chaos, people standing, talking, some cheering, but Frank stayed silent, holding his daughter, processing the betrayal of his friend and the power of his little girl's crayon drawings that had revealed the truth. Sarah wiped tears from her eyes as she watched Emily burrow deeper into her father's embrace. Through the window, afternoon sunlight streamed in, warming their faces as justice finally prevailed. Judge Thompson's gavel cracked through the noise. "Order! Order in the court!" He waited for silence before continuing. "In light of Mr. Green's confession and the evidence presented, all charges against Frank Miller are hereby dismissed. Mr. Miller, you are free to go. This court is adjourned." The heavy wooden doors opened, and Harold disappeared between the officers, leaving behind a wake of shocked faces and the unraveling of his carefully constructed lies. The old courthouse clock ticked loudly in the heavy silence. Emily nestled deeper into Sarah's lap, her small fingers intertwined with Frank's weathered hand through the wooden barrier. Her other hand clutched her trusted box of crayons, the same ones that had helped reveal the truth about Harold's lies just hours ago. Frank's orange jail uniform seemed less bright now, as if hope had started washing away the harsh color. Dark circles rimmed his eyes, but a gentle smile touched his lips whenever Emily squeezed his hand. Sarah kept her arm protectively around Emily's shoulders, her nurse's uniform wrinkled from the long day of testimony. The jury had been out for 3 hours. Every time the courtroom door creaked, heads snapped up, only to slump again when it was just another court officer or lawyer passing through. Pastor Jenkins sat directly behind them, his Bible open in his lap, lips moving in silent prayer. Emily's drawings covered the defense table, a rainbow-colored timeline of truth. The one on top showed Harold sneaking into the community center that fateful night, drawn with the simple honesty only a child could capture. Next to it lay the bank statements proving Harold's massive gambling debts, and the forensic report confirming the forged signatures. "Daddy," Emily whispered, her voice carrying in the quiet room, "my tummy feels funny." Frank squeezed her hand. "That's just butterflies, sweetheart. Everyone gets them when they're waiting for something important." A few rows back, some of Frank's veteran buddies sat ramrod straight in their chairs, their military bearing unchanged by age. They had testified about Frank's character, about nights when he'd given them shelter during rough times, about how he'd never taken so much as an extra penny from the coffee fund. Mrs. Rodriguez, who ran the food bank, dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. Her testimony about Frank volunteering extra hours, often bringing Emily along to help sort cans, had moved several jurors to tears. "He gave when he had nothing to give," she'd said, her accent thick with emotion. The afternoon sun slanted through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the worn carpet. Emily yawned, fighting to keep her eyes open. She'd been so brave during her own testimony, pointing at her drawing and explaining in clear, simple words how she'd seen Harold at the center late at night when she and Frank had gone back to get her forgotten stuffed bunny. "Want some water?" Sarah asked softly, reaching for the paper cup on the rail. Emily shook her head, gripping Frank's hand tighter. "Not until Daddy can have some too." Frank swallowed hard at her words, and Sarah noticed him blinking rapidly. A tissue appeared over their shoulders, Pastor Jenkins leaning forward with a kind smile. The veteran closest to them, old Joe, with his silver crew cut, cleared his throat. "That little girl of yours. Frank, she's something special." Frank nodded, unable to speak. Emily beamed at Joe, then pulled out a fresh piece of paper and her crayons. Her small hands moved deliberately across the page, drawing what looked like a group of people holding hands. The bailiff suddenly appeared at the side door. "All rise!" Everyone scrambled to their feet. Emily dropped her crayon, clutching both Sarah and Frank's hands as Judge Thompson entered, his black robe sweeping behind him. The jury filed in after him, their faces unreadable. "Be seated," the judge intoned, settling into his chair. He looked different now, less stern, somehow. His eyes lingered on Emily for a moment before turning to the jury foreman. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" "We have, Your Honor." The foreman stood, a piece of paper trembling slightly in his hands. The entire courtroom seemed to hold its breath. Emily pressed herself closer to Sarah, who wrapped both arms around her. Frank's hand was cold in Emily's grip. In the matter of the state versus Frank Miller, On the charge of embezzlement, we find the defendant. Emily squeezed her eyes shut. Not guilty. The words hung in the air for a split second before the courtroom erupted. Frank sagged in his chair, tears finally breaking free. Sarah burst into sobs, hugging Emily so tight she squeaked. Behind them, the veterans were all standing, calling out, "Semper Fi!" while Pastor Jenkins raised his hands in prayer. But Judge Thompson wasn't finished. He raised his gavel, calling for order. When quiet finally fell, he removed his glasses, revealing eyes that glistened with emotion. "Mr. Miller," he began, his voice rougher than usual, "this court owes you an apology. Your innocence was proven not just by evidence, but by the pure heart of a child who never stopped believing in her father." He looked directly at Emily. "Young lady, your drawing showed us all what truth really looks like." Emily smiled shyly, reaching for her latest drawing, the one she'd just started. "I was drawing us all together again," she explained, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Because I knew we would be." The judge smiled, something rarely seen in his courtroom. "Mr. Miller, you are hereby released from custody." He lifted his gavel one last time, and may this serve as a reminder that justice, like love, sometimes comes in the most unexpected packages. The gavel fell with a crack that echoed through the courtroom. But this time, instead of sealing imprisonment, it broke chains. Frank was free. Emily scrambled over the barrier into her father's arms, his orange jumpsuit already wet with her tears. "I told you I'd prove it, Daddy! I told you!" Frank held her close, his voice choked with emotion. "You sure did, baby girl. You sure did." Sarah wrapped her arms around them both, and soon they were surrounded by well-wishers, veterans clapping Frank on the back, church members offering hugs, even the courthouse staff wiping away tears. Emily's drawings fluttered on the defense table, their simple crayon strokes having accomplished what all the fancy legal arguments couldn't. They had revealed the truth. Through it all, Judge Thompson remained seated, watching the scene unfold. He picked up Emily's last drawing, the one of people holding hands, and carefully folded it into his pocket. Sometimes, he realized, justice needed to be seen through the eyes of a child to be truly clear. The setting sun painted the jail's gray walls with streaks of orange and gold as Frank Miller stepped through the heavy metal doors, no longer wearing prison orange, but his own worn blue shirt and faded jeans that Sarah had brought him. His steps were uncertain at first, like a man walking on new legs, but his eyes lit up at the crowd gathered in the parking lot. Veterans stood at attention, their weathered faces breaking into broad smiles. Some wore their old service caps, badges gleaming in the evening light. Pastor Jenkins stood among them, his usual black suit replaced by casual clothes, but his warm presence just as commanding. Dozens of townspeople clustered around, holding welcome home signs decorated with copies of Emily's drawings. "Daddy?" Emily's voice cut through the murmur of the crowd. She broke free from Sarah's grasp and ran full speed across the pavement, her pink dress fluttering, dark curls bouncing with each step. Frank knelt down, arms wide open, and caught her as she launched herself at him. He lifted her high into the air, spinning her around as tears streamed down his face. "My brave girl," he whispered, holding her close. "My beautiful, brave girl." Sarah approached more slowly, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. She wrapped both Frank and Emily in a tight hug, her nurse's composure finally cracking as she let out a sob of relief. "Welcome home, Frank." Pastor Jenkins stepped forward, his booming laugh echoing across the parking lot. "Make way, folks. Let's give this man some breathing room." The crowd parted, creating a path, but they couldn't contain their joy. People reached out to pat Frank's shoulder, shake his hand, or simply touch him as if to make sure he was real. "Miller!" a gruff voice called out. 3 veterans, guys from Frank's old unit, pushed forward. The tallest one, Jim Cooper, still wore his Marine Corps pin on his jacket. "The boys and I have something for you." They presented Frank with a small box wrapped in brown paper. Frank shifted Emily to his hip, she refused to let go, and opened the gift with one hand. Inside was a new Vietnam service medal, replacing the one he'd had to sell years ago to pay for Emily's winter coat. His fingers trembled as he touched it. "We remember what you did for us over there," Jim said gruffly. just like we remember everything you've done here at home." More people pressed forward with gifts: casseroles and covered dishes, hand-knitted scarves, cards filled with grocery store gift cards. Mrs. Chen from the Chinese restaurant brought hot containers of Frank's favorite sweet and sour chicken. Mr. Patterson from the hardware store promised a month of free handyman supplies. Emily tugged on Frank's collar, her face serious. "Daddy, can we go to Aunt Sarah's now? I'm hungry, and I have something special to show you." Frank looked at his daughter's eager face and nodded. "Of course, sweetheart." He turned to the crowd, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you all. I don't have words." "Save the speeches for Sunday," Pastor Jenkins called out, with a wink. "God's grace works through community, and this community stands with you." Frank Miller. The drive to Sarah's house was quick, just 3 blocks from the jail. Emily sat in the back seat next to Frank, refusing to let go of his hand. Sarah drove carefully, stealing glances in the rear-view mirror as if afraid Frank might disappear. Sarah's small bungalow glowed with warmth. She'd left the porch light on that morning, hoping for exactly this outcome. The kitchen table was already set for 4. Pastor Jenkins would join them, with her best tablecloth and the good plates she usually saved for Christmas. While Sarah heated the food people had brought, Emily led Frank to the living room couch. She pulled out her drawing pad and crayons, now worn down to stubs from weeks of determined artwork. "Close your eyes, Daddy," she instructed solemnly. Frank obeyed, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. He heard paper rustling, then Emily's small hands placing something in his lap. "Okay, open them." Frank opened his eyes to find himself looking at Emily's latest masterpiece. In crayon strokes full of love and determination, she had drawn him standing in the center of a crowd. Unlike her previous drawings that had helped prove his innocence, this one showed him surrounded by smiling faces. Pastor Jenkins with his distinctive beard, Sarah in her nurse's uniform, veterans in their caps, and townspeople he recognized. At the front of the group stood Emily herself, holding his hand. Above them all, she had drawn a huge yellow sun and a rainbow. "See, Daddy?" Emily pointed proudly. "Everyone knows you're good now. Everyone loves you again." Frank's vision blurred with tears. He pulled Emily into his lap, pressing his face into her hair to hide his emotion. "You saved me, sweetheart," he whispered. "You never stopped believing in me." Sarah appeared in the doorway, wiping her hands on a dish towel. Her eyes were red, but she smiled. "Dinner's ready. Pastor Jenkins just pulled up." The kitchen was warm and bright, filled with the mingled aromas of different dishes from their friends and neighbors. Pastor Jenkins said grace, his deep voice trembling slightly, as he thanked God for justice and the pure faith of a child. They passed dishes around the table, talking and laughing, while Emily kept one hand firmly on her father's arm as if to anchor him there. Frank looked around at this small gathering. His daughter, his sister-in-law, his pastor, the drawings on the wall, the food made with love, and felt something tight in his chest finally release. He was home. He was free. And it was all because a 6-year-old girl had believed in him with unshakable faith, armed with nothing but crayons and truth. Emily caught his eye and beamed, sauce smeared on her chin. "I love you, Daddy," she said simply. "I love you too, sweetheart," Frank replied, voice rough with emotion. "I love you too." The morning sun streamed through the freshly cleaned windows of the community center, casting warm light on the newly polished floors. Colorful balloons bobbed gently in the breeze from the open doors, and a hand-painted banner reading, "Welcome back, Frank," stretched across the entrance. The lobby buzzed with excitement as townspeople filed in for the reopening ceremony. Frank Miller stood near the entrance, tugging at his collar, still not quite used to wearing a tie. His weathered hands smoothed down his best shirt, the one Emily had helped him iron that morning. She'd insisted he look extra special today, and he couldn't say no to those earnest brown eyes. "Daddy, look!" Emily tugged at his sleeve, pointing to the wall where her drawings now hung in simple wooden frames. "They look so pretty up there." Frank's throat tightened as he looked at the collection. Each crayon masterpiece told their story. Him serving food to the homeless, fixing the playground swing, praying at church. The final drawing showed him surrounded by smiling townspeople, stick figures with hearts around them. Below each frame was a small brass plaque with titles like A Father's Love and Community Spirit. Pastor Jenkins approached, resting a hand on Frank's shoulder. "Those drawings did more than prove your innocence, Frank. They reminded us what community really means." The veterans who had supported Frank through his ordeal gathered near the refreshment table, their medals glinting in the sunlight. One of them, old Joe Murphy, raised his coffee cup in salute. "Never doubted you for a minute, brother." Sarah bustled around, arranging cookies on paper plates and straightening name tags. She paused to wipe happy tears from her eyes when she saw Emily proudly showing visitors her framed artwork. "And this one," Emily explained to Mrs. Thompson from the quilting circle, "is when Daddy fixed Mr. Garcia's wheelchair after it broke. See the smile I drew on Mr. Garcia's face?" The mayor cleared his throat at the small podium set up near the center's front desk. The crowd quieted as he adjusted his glasses. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're here today not just to reopen our beloved community center, but to right a wrong and honor a man who has given so much to this town." Frank felt Emily's small hand slip into his as the mayor continued. "Frank Miller has served this community tirelessly, asking nothing in return. His innocence was proven not through complex legal arguments, but through the pure heart of a child who never stopped believing in her father." The mayor gestured to the wall of drawings. These simple crayon pictures revealed more truth than any bank statement or legal document. They showed us the real Frank Miller, the man who stays late to help clean up after events, who fixes broken equipment with spare parts from his own garage, who makes sure every child at the center gets a birthday card. Emily beamed up at Frank, and he squeezed her hand gently. His vision blurred with tears as the mayor presented him with a plaque, naming him the official director of the community center. "Speech!" someone called from the crowd. Others joined in, clapping encouragingly. Frank cleared his throat, stepping up to the podium. Emily wouldn't let go of his hand, so she came with him, standing proud beside her father. "I'm not much for fancy words," Frank began, his voice rough with emotion, "but I want to thank you all, especially those who stood by me when things looked darkest." He looked down at Emily. "My daughter never stopped believing in me. Her faith gave me strength when I had none left." He gestured to the framed drawings. "These pictures show more than just what I did. They show what this community means to me. It's about helping each other, believing in each other, standing together when times get tough." The afternoon passed in a blur of handshakes, hugs, and congratulations. People brought covered dishes for a potluck celebration. The center's halls rang with laughter and conversation. Even the judge stopped by, this time openly, and with a warm smile, to shake Frank's hand. As the sun began to set, the crowd thinned. Emily sat at one of the round tables, yawning as she added another drawing to her collection. This one of the day's celebration. Frank watched her from across the room, his heart full. Sarah came up beside him, touching his arm. "Ready to head home? Someone looks tired." Frank nodded, gathering Emily's crayons while she carefully folded her new drawing. Together, they walked out into the cool evening air. The stars were just beginning to peek out above the trees. At home, Frank helped Emily get ready for bed, making sure she brushed her teeth and put on her favorite pajamas with the yellow ducks. She climbed into bed, but instead of lying down, she sat up, looking serious. "Are you proud of me, Daddy?" she asked, her voice small and sweet in the dim light of her bedside lamp. Frank sat on the edge of her bed, his heart swelling with love. He leaned forward and kissed her forehead tenderly. "More than words, Emily. You didn't just prove I'm innocent, you taught us all about hope." Emily's face lit up with a peaceful smile as she snuggled down into her covers, still clutching her crayons. Her eyes drifted closed, and Frank watched as his precious daughter, his defender and his hero, slipped into peaceful dreams. What would you do if you were in their place? Comment your answer below, and let's see how you'd rewrite the ending. If you enjoyed the story of Frank Miller, I handpicked the next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.